But now we'll quickly move into our panel discussion on sustainability itself, and it'll be a good follow-on to the discussion. So can I invite the speakers here on stage, please? So Pradeep, could you join us on stage to moderate the session? We have Hisham, who's come all the, he's the CEO for Environmental Defense Fund. Amol is here from Berkeley, Rajat from Shiv Nadar, and of course, we have Mr. Belani from Greenco. Could we have you on stage? And you have exactly 40 minutes, please.
Thank you, Amit. Best part is the later we go into the day, the less time we get. So, I think a comment made yesterday by Mazumdar, I think, sets the tone for this discussion. When he said we have barely 20 years to get our act together. And this conjunction of economic growth, development, and sustainability is critical. Traditionally, these have been three separate silos, which have had their own dynamics and their own trajectories. I mean, in India, not too long ago, in the pre-Amitabh Kant era, economic growth was something that the economic agents did. And the role of the state was to erect the entry barrier and the exit barrier and a hurdle race in between. Development was something which was autonomous. You had economic growth happening in India, but development indices till not very long back, which were comparable to sub-Saharan Africa. We talk about infant mortality and other social indices and learning outcomes. And sustainability was something we did at platforms like this. I mean, if you go back, Rajat, you will recall 1992 Earth Summit, Rio. The traditional Indian bureaucratic way of looking at climate change then was that you took your time industrializing, polluted the world, now it's my chance, and if you want me to do something, you pay for it. And it was a fairly dogmatic kind of a stance. That has changed, hopefully. To set the ball rolling, we have a very distinguished panel because we have representation from academia, which is Rajat. We have Dr. Fatke, who has fascinating work in the report of 2035. He talks about actually decarbonizing power systems in the US, and the costs are lower. I find that fascinating because, interestingly, energy costs in the US and India are not very different. Average tariff in India, if I'm not mistaken, is around 6 rupees per unit kilowatt hour. In the US, is around 12 to 15 cents, which is about 9 to 10 rupees. It's almost comparable. So whatever you've done in the US has applicability in India. Ashok Belani is an extremely distinguished professional from the energy sector, and we were conversing before the panel, and apparently he's done work on, or doing work on, tracking methane gas emissions, which is really critical. I must confess, I'm a bit confused by my role because I was supposed to be a panelist and I was going to talk about some of those issues, but I come back to it later. And Hisham Mandal brings a distinguished corporate perspective and a practice in terms of advisory and implementation in terms of how corporates can be more sustainable in terms of decarbonizing. I'm not going to second guess what you're going to say, but let me start with you, Rajat. You've been a participant and a key observer of the Indian growth story from your days in ICRIER till as Dean of Shiv Nadar University. How do you see this conjunction panning out? Is there a mindset change? Okay, before you start, we have an election coming around in a few months' time. Do you think climate change or sustainability figures in the manifestos of any of the political parties? I'll leave it to you to respond.
I'm sure it'll be in the manifestos, but whether it'll be a part of the campaigning, I'm not so sure. Remember, since we're sitting in North America, you remember NAFTA 92 was being discussed between the US and Canada and Mexico. And at that time, Ross Perot stood as an independent candidate, I think, and he was very critical of NAFTA, and he said there'll be a giant sucking sound and all the jobs will vanish to Mexico. And trade was not even mentioned on the agenda in the election campaign in the United States. So I don't think, it'll be a part of the campaign. It will be buried in the manifestos.
My point was, is it entering mainstream political discourse to the extent it needs to, given what we were told yesterday? You've got 20 years to get your act together.
I think so. I think so. But you won't hear it in the speeches. You won't hear it in the campaigns, but you will see it. And I'll tell you change. I mean, you made a really good point, Pradeep, about, when Kamal Nath was in the Rio summit, he said, we are not going to save our trees because you want to drive your cars in Los Angeles. That was a very famous quote of Kamal Nath at that time. And our international perspective, I think, has remained sort of in that neighborhood. But the good thing, what has happened within India, is that the domestic narrative has changed. The international narrative continues to be, and I think it's justifiably so, that there is, as Arun was saying yesterday, there is a carbon space that is available, and that carbon space is occupied by countries who have developed before us, and that needs to be shared equally, and there needs to be a compensation, both technological compensation, technology flow without IPRs, like we sort of proposed in COVID, during COVID, and also there needs to be a financial flow. So that remains an international narrative for us in negotiations in climate change. But I think the domestic narrative has completely changed. And one of the reasons the domestic narrative has completely changed is because I think, as we are constantly told by the interlocutors from the West, that it's in your own interest to do that. And it is indeed in our interest to do that, because I mean, we will suffer in agriculture. Professor Ramesh Chand will tell you, we'll suffer in industry, we'll suffer in manufacturing, because the impacts of climate change will be deleterious. I mean, you know that Bombay and Kolkata are all at risk as a result of sea level rise. So the domestic narrative has changed. And I think we're putting our money where our mouth is. There is increase in solar capacity, there's increase in wind capacity. You know, the chart that Anil showed just a while ago, and which remains the grave concern for India, and it links to our development objectives also, is that coal will still remain dominant. You know, whether you like it or not, you go to 2030, you go to 2040, you're incremental, you may not build any more coal plants, but coal will remain a dominant source of energy for India until, IEA says until 2040 or 2047, we will remain at least 30% of our energy will come from coal. And that remains a concern because, jobs are tied to coal, communities are tied to coal, you need to do reskilling to move to renewables, and all that is happening. So the domestic, within the country, the narrative or the policies are changing both at the center and at the states. And there are some states that are moving very, very rapidly, and jobs are also going to be created. So I think all is, in terms of our sort of energy transition that Anil was talking about, things are fine domestically. They could be better. But if the West wants us to move out of coal quickly, create carbon markets, and that's going to be challenging because the role here we are talking about development and sustainability. Creating a carbon market of 100 euros or $100 per ton of carbon, that will be a challenge for India, but that will not speak to our development objectives. So while we would like to create carbon markets, I mean, we'll do it, when it meets with our development goals.
Rajat, you make some very interesting points, but if you recall Glasgow, we unilaterally took on obligations which we've never done before. There's a sea change in the way the government is looking at climate change internationally without the compulsions.
Right. So those commitments that will be net zero by 2070, I think we can meet those challenges. I mean, we are likely because our population will peak in 2050, we'll be 1.7 billion people, right? And that's when our demographics will start reversing. Population decline will only happen after 2050. We will be 1 billion workforce in 2050, UN projections, give or take a few million. So you'll be 1 billion population, workforce, and 1.7 billion. Until then, I think, so the net zero will probably come a little later. Peak coal will happen later for India. Peak coal, China says, will happen only in 2035. Peak coal for India will happen, I think, after 2035 for India. I think 2040, 2035.
Great, Rajat.
Yeah.
We'll come back to you a little later. Can I now turn to Mr. Mandal and share with us how this conjunction is driving what you do in terms of advising corporates? Because at the end of the day, for every unit of consumption, if you can't reduce the input, the carbon input, which is really a technology issue, and it's also a behavioral issue at the corporate level, Much of this is really talk and nothing more.
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. Just to clarify, we don't just work with companies, we work a lot with governments. In fact, we're advising the Indian government on the design of the carbon market. So just one thing to keep in mind, building on what Rajat was saying, is climate change isn't caused by what we're doing today or tomorrow. It is caused mostly by what we've done since the start of the industrial age. India's contributed less than 5% of global emissions. And whenever there are these conversations about some other countries wanting us to shut down this or that, it would be well served for them to remember this number. And if they are as concerned as they are, then show the money for it. But having said that, there are pathways to economic growth that have been demonstrated in the past, the European, North American, Chinese pathways. These are high emissions-led growth pathways that have been there. India looks at this and, at one level, we justifiably say that we are 1/10 of US per capita emissions or 1/4 of US European or Chinese emissions. But we also know that the impacts of climate change, our poor, our health infrastructure, our food systems wouldn't be able to absorb those shocks. And there is a radically different Indian pathway that's being carved out. The big push on renewables is already there, the improvements in energy efficiency, but also in terms of the general, discourse. You do not have the kind of, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, the crazy conversations about climate change that are happening in India. On the global stage, India might not be the most glamorous player, but they are a steady player. India's not going to change its position radically, in the next 2 years, unlike what might happen in the US, what has happened in the UK, what is beginning to show signs of happening in some parts of Europe. And I just wanted to introduce one concept, which is the race to the top. There used to be a time when people didn't understand climate change, and then we went through this phase of denying climate change. And now a number of nations and companies have realized that it's not growth or sustainability, but that there is growth from sustainability. And I want to give 2 or 3 illustrations. 1.5 million electric vehicles were sold in India last year, most of them scooters, 3-wheelers. The highest selling electric vehicle is the Tata Nexon at about $15,000. I give these points because in the US, the EV revolution, the price had been around for a while, but it really took off when Tesla came in with a really cool car. But it was at $50,000. What did China do? BYD, $12,000 or $13,000. These middle of the pyramid innovation is what you desperately need to address the climate change crisis. And those are the kind of innovations that India has been really, really good at. The second example is, and we talk about the green premium as an idea in climate, a new technology that comes in, which is currently expensive, and you want economies of scale or improvements of technology to bring the price down. There is authentically a green bonus that a lot of industry is beginning to see. The cement sector, odd term, but Indian cement is regarded as amongst the greenest in the world because 85% of the raw material is fly ash. 60% is made using renewables, and the overall manufacturing process is a quarter more energy efficient. LED light bulbs is a $2 billion a year industry in India. High energy efficiency ceiling fans is a $500 million industry. So there's lots of examples where people are beginning to see ways of making money while doing right for the environment. I think one word of caution that is there is the amount of money that we spend on R&D in the country is far, and I'm not even talking about climate change. We spend 0.6 to 0.7% of GDP. That's compared to 1.5% for industrial countries. The US spends, close to 3%. There's a desperate need to increase that. And on top of that, only 40% of our R&D money comes from the private sector, as opposed to 70%. You need more money, you need more private sector money, and you need deeper partnerships between government, research, and corporates to advance those tougher issues.
Ashok, you make some excellent points. Just to go back to your BYD example, BYD till 10 years back was a little shop tucked away somewhere in some province in China. Yeah. And this year produced 4.4 million EVs for export. That didn't come about accidentally. The Chinese state was involved incubating the technology, whether through a subsidy or a tax regime, etc., is something we need to look at very carefully. Ashok, can I now turn to you? And you have a vast knowledge of the energy space, and that's where all carbon comes from.
Well, yeah, I do. My past has been in companies which, well, in a technology company that works for the oil and gas industry. But all those companies that we have worked for in the past are in the process of thinking forward as to what happens in the world of clean energy. Now, in clean energy, I think supporting all the discussions that have gone on and talking about economic growth, development, and sustainability, I think clean energy is by far the topmost or the leading opportunity for business and economic growth for the next 3-5 decades. Just like digital data, artificial intelligence have started back in, say, the 1980s or 90s and continues, and it'll continue for a long period of time. Similarly, clean energy is actually a similar large opportunity for business and economic development. And there's an interesting aspect here, which from a global level you can look at. There are countries which are fossil fuel poor, and there are countries which are fossil fuel rich. The transition to clean energy is obviously simpler in countries which are fossil fuel poor, because they will try to move into that direction in the future. The other thing is that clean energy comes from natural resources, so countries which are resource rich and fossil fuel poor will move towards clean energy a lot faster. And hence, from both those points of view, fossil fuel poor and resource rich, India is an interesting place because it has clean energy as a very important and very viable and very, let's say, it's a great opportunity for India for the next 3-4 decades. Now, I think the only other thing that people talk about is capital, and I don't think capital is an issue today. And when you look today on a global basis, and we look at projects in the United States, we look at what's happening in Europe, I think at least in the last 3 years or so, I see the development that's going on, and I will club the whole area of Asia. In Asia, there's more development towards clean energy than there is in the United States and Europe. The United States and Europe, they talk a lot, but they do less. And India and China, they talk less, but they do a whole lot more, if you like, right? And so along those lines, like the project that Anil showed in his talk, the 15 gigawatt hour pump storage project that he showed in Kurnool, and the plans that are there for 100 gigawatt hour for continuously clean energy, and where the renewable energy is resourced anywhere in the country and put into these pump storages and provided anywhere in the country as 24/7. And then from that to actually be able to make 5 megatons of ammonia or 1 megaton of hydrogen, whichever way you want to look at it. This is by far the most advanced project on clean energy anywhere in the world. It does not exist anywhere else, And here the cost points are without any subsidies, no subsidies whatsoever. The cost points are actually competitive with any other form of energy anywhere else in the world. This is truly groundbreaking, and it is happening in India. And why? Because it is a big opportunity, because there's a ripe market, because it creates local economy and local development, and it is moving the world in a good direction. It is, by the way, not being justified by some do-good attitudes toward climate change. And I don't mean that climate change is only do-good stuff, but you hear a lot of that in the United States and in Europe. In this case, it is being done for purely economic reasons and for the right reasons, and it is moving the country to the good direction. So I think there's a lot more of this that can happen. Asia is a ripe place, including China and India. And, it has, and both capital and technology are not the issues. There is technology, there is capital. What is an issue most of the time in energy is that energy is all about scale. And in energy, you cannot make it cost effective without going to scale, and you cannot go to scale without making it cost effective. And hence, you need groundbreaking projects like the one that AM Green is doing to be able to go to this next level of efficiency that then becomes a business in the future. So I just want to conclude saying clean energy is a great opportunity for the whole world, for economic growth and for local development and for sustainability.
I take it, Ashok, you're confident that whatever the government talks about in terms of clean energy and zero 2070 are eminently achievable within technology that's known today. It's not technology has to come tomorrow.
Well, I think this is a separate discussion. I think you need to start small.
Okay.
You need to start with tens of gigawatt hours and hundreds of gigawatt hours, or hundreds of gigawatts, let's say, and storage of hundreds of gigawatt hours, and that moves you in the good direction. Now, where you reach, that depends on how fast the whole thing starts to roll, if you like.
Thank you, Ashok.
And I'm not trying to predict anything about how fast it's going to be able to roll.
Thank you. I now turn to Dr. Fatke, who's done some fascinating work in the report for 2035. At the core of climate change, there are two aspects. I think if you whittle it down to its basics, there is behavioral change and there's technology. And you've shown in your work, and I hope we hear more about it, in terms of how you can decarbonize power transmission, and this is relevance in the Indian context.
Yeah, so I think looking at the big picture, what has really changed in the last 10 years is that cost of clean technology has come down more than 80%. So it's become all about the money as well. So, what's the biggest climate legislation in the US called? Is it called a climate legislation? What is it called? It's called the Inflation Reduction Act. Right. Case in point. So what we have found in our research is that the only way to kind of move big policy, inform big policy, is to show massive benefits to economy and consumers. And this is where I feel that there is a lot at stake as countries act on climate change. So just to give you one example, that in 2019, India exported more automobiles than China. How's that for a change? And Japan and Germany exported 5x of that. Well, we know that. Come 2023, China's auto exports increased 400%, and they are on track to outpace Japan and Germany in 2024, while India's auto exports stayed the same. And all those auto exports were driven by export of electric vehicles. Now, this didn't come about by an accident. There was a systematic carrot and stick policy implemented in China, with massive subsidies, but also a requirement on automakers to produce a certain percentage of electric vehicles. That kind of got to this question of scale and cost reductions. So a lot is at stake, and so we do a lot of research along clean technology. So we looked at this, where does this leave India? What are the 5 biggest leapfrog opportunities given this dynamics of scale and cost reductions? And we have established a center at UC Berkeley on clean energy in India, and here's our kind of 5 takeaways. First is that India has done phenomenally well on solar. And they have implemented this cycle of cost-effective energy and cost reductions. But there's an incredible opportunity to take the success of solar and replicate in sectors such as automotive, where there is incentive but needs to be matched by what China did and what California did in requiring automakers to move towards mandates. It has incredible opportunity in green steel and jet fuel, and what we find in our study is that it's more beneficial to not export green hydrogen, but to actually export the finished product. to export green steel, to export SAP. This is where the margins are. This is where, so with smart strategy, India has done a lot of successful things, but it has one of the best opportunities in the world to really benefit from the climate transition. So
Dr. Anmol, do you want to talk about your decarbonization of power transmission? Because I thought...
Sure. So I think, we have published a number of studies on US, Japan, Korea, and in all those studies, what we are finding is because of the cost of clean technologies come down 70 to 80%, you can nearly decarbonize power and transportation sectors with massive reductions to consumer cost, which was not the case even 5 years ago. So this is where the great opportunity lies. In fact, our work, which showed that a lot of the previous study had showed that US could decarbonize its power system by 2050. We published few major reports saying that that timeline could be accelerated by 15 years. You could go 90% clean by 2035. But the biggest selling point was that it actually reduces consumer costs. That, in fact, formed the basis of the current administration targets of 100% clean electricity in 2035. So this is where things have really changed in the last 5 to 10 years. But it does require not only incentives, which a lot of governments are giving, but some requirements or mandates on manufacturers to go clean to break this cycle of high cost and low volume.
Anmol, if I'm followed what you said, you talked about China's success in EVs. Now, we were doing some work with Amit at the IFC on studying what happened in China. And we're trying to aggregate the total exposure. I mean, you give a subsidy or a tax foregone. It came to something in excess of $100 billion in China, which took from 0 to 4.4 million vehicles this year. Now, if you want to do something similar in India, I don't see Tata's balance sheet being able to scale things up on that level. You're talking about 30% EVs by 2030. That's about 1.2 million vehicles. Right?
So I think this is where India is in a luckier position. One of my favorite cricketers is Sachin Tendulkar. He would play a brilliant late cut. So what I'm trying to say here is that China had to dole out all this cash because battery prices were 3x, 4x, right? So the battery prices have plummeted 80 to 90%. So what India needs to do, India has a brilliant program on FAME. It needs to put a requirement on manufacturers that 20% of X production needs to come from EVs. Now, 5 years ago, that would have imposed enormous cost on Tatas and would not have been a viable policy. That's no longer the case. Because the cost of batteries have come down, ICE engines and EVs are coming very close to parity. So with a little bit of policy push and a brilliant late cut, we don't have to spend 100 billion because somebody already did.
Well, okay, I'll finish on EV and we go on to other subjects. The total demand for batteries in India will be something 200 gigawatts. We presently produce something like 2 gigawatts. China does 900 gigawatts. Why shouldn't we just import? Because 900 gigawatts is something that would take at enormous state cost. We let the Chinese taxpayer subsidize the Indian vehicle owner.
So if you currently look at the cost of batteries, if I look at the kind of global Bloomberg price of $100 per kilowatt hour, the subsidy amount in it is about 10%. Even Tesla, at its scale, is producing batteries below $100 because they have advanced manufacturing. So it's not the case that battery industry is just driven by subsidies from China and then we should just, that's not true, actually. The subsidy amounts have reduced, and with advanced manufacturing, you can be at actually competitive price points. So if India starts today, it actually is an advantageous position because it's not all a subsidy game anymore.
What about raw materials?
Raw materials, I think, is a very interesting question. So for example, lithium iron phosphate is the dominant chemistry that is being used. Now, what has really happened that there was a huge hue and cry about cobalt. But a lot of automakers moved away from cobalt to lithium iron phosphate. And lithium is in plentiful supply. It's actually, yes, it's a critical material, but it's in plentiful supply. There are more discoveries of lithium every day. not every day, but India has also found significant amount of lithium. I don't know the status of extraction, but as there is a huge technological response so I don't think lithium is a constraint at all. Yes, it needs to be addressed, but it's not a constraint at all. And in fact, so we did this report on India, which looked at how India can achieve energy independence by 2047, a goal announced by the Prime Minister using clean technology. And we actually find, even if India doesn't produce any lithium, to substitute an import of $100 billion of oil. Remember, India imports nearly all of its oil. You need $1 billion of lithium import. So yes, lithium is talked about as a constraint, but just to give you a bottom line, it's not a constraint.
Thank you. I think Amit is making faces at me. Not very. So I wanted to just open, invite questions from the House.
Can I just add one
Sure,
point
please.
on this? Increasingly, climate policy and climate technologies are getting weaponized by nations. And obviously one needs to go to a place where you can buy it cheaply, but replacing fossil fuel dependency with any other kind of dependencies is not the right move from a national strategic point of view. At EDF, we're very proud of the work that we did on the IRA bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a great bill, the biggest emitters, putting in $260 billion, et cetera. But on the downside, it is build in America, make in America, et cetera, et cetera. Now, to be fair, Biden needed to do that because he wasn't going to be able to sell the bill. But you could turn it around and say it's another form of trade protection measures. The European Union's upcoming regulations, enlightened view, protect climate change. Not so enlightened view is, put an additional barrier, a green barrier on imports. So we have to start developing a view that the days of the global village and kumbaya are over. We need to secure our national interests.
So you make a very interesting point of weaponization. There's EU legislation either in the offing or already there. There were, for example, steel imports from India. If they don't conform to EU standards in terms of processes, there's an additional tax on that. Yeah. This is weaponization.
That's coming in 26. But companies have already to start reporting on what is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure, CBAM. And US has asked for an opt-out from the European Union. I don't know whether they'll get it or not. But now it's interesting, the linkage between trade and protectionism and climate change is not new. It goes back sort of until at least the 90s when you had the meeting in Seattle of the WTO. So that is going to be an interesting area for countries. But CBAM is coming in 26, and it will impact India's sort of exports of steel largely, aluminum, and the impact. It's not going to be a problem for Tatas. Right. It's not going to be a problem for Jindal. They'll probably decarbonize. But it'll be a problem for the smaller micro enterprises that will face challenges on that. And, somebody made a remark about electric arc furnace and steel scrap. But we import all our steel scrap. We have almost no steel scrap that is domestic. If that was available, then steel would decarbonize very quickly.
Anmol, you had something here.
Yeah, so I think on trade, it's a very interesting, point in time that on one hand, there is a lot of protectionism. On the other hand, because of wariness about imports from China, there is a lot of push, at least in the US, to diversify supply chains. So it's an incredible opportunity for India. Just to give you a very concrete example. There is about $1 trillion worth of assets in the US waiting to be connected to the grid. And we cannot connect because there is interconnection queue issues. And what is the challenge US is facing? Not enough transformers. Because suddenly there is an import issue with China. Mexico and Canada cannot produce enough. Incredible opportunity for India. Same story with electrolyzers. So, protectionism and trade will create interesting challenges and opportunities. And it's a very interesting space for India right now.
Great. Can we ask, do you have time for questions? I think there's one gentleman at the back. Please, sir.
Hi, everyone. I had one question on how do you all see like the advent of BRSR, that's business responsibility and sustainability reporting, really shifting the trajectory on economic growth, development, and sustainability in India?
Can I ask maybe you do?
Sure. And I think there is a shareholder value creation opportunity. So forget about BRSR and what the regulators ask you to report, et cetera. Companies are realizing that if I don't go greener, forget about thriving. I may not survive into the future. There's a big steel company. It's got interests all over the world. It's expanding operations in Europe as green steel. It's expanding operations in India as something called greener steel, where there is some green steel, but the majority of it is traditional blast furnaces. They're not doing that because they hate India. They're doing that because there's less regulatory oversight, there's less investor pressure, there's less consumer demand, and there's less government subsidy. And the argument that their investors need to make is, we're buying into a 60-year asset. In 10 years' time, that asset isn't going to be able to sell a gram of steel into Europe. In 20 years' time, it might be uncompetitive in India. So you rework your Excel spreadsheets to say a 20-year asset and then see whether I should be investing more in electric arc furnaces. Having said that, do you need BRSR? Absolutely. You need better, stronger, clearer ones. You want BRSR to be as much of an investment criteria that an investor chooses as you do some of the other considerations of price earnings, et cetera, et cetera. So it needs to be there. That transparency is helpful, but at the end of the day, naked profit is what will drive it.
Right.
Great. We have one more question in the back. I mean, we have time. Yeah.
Hello.
Makes a very important point because
Two of them.
Amol makes a very important point, and I think that this is a massive opportunity for India. And if we do not go green, and we'll not be able to export after some time, and therefore, actually, automobile sector is a very important sector for India's economy. And as the world moves from 2,000 parts to 20 parts, I think, we are a champion of combustion vehicles. We should actually mandate that by 2030, all two-wheelers, three-wheelers in a phased manner will go electric. And that is when you will take over the manufacturing of the world. You'll become a global champion of electric vehicle manufacturing. Otherwise, you lose your automobile competitiveness. And secondly, on the battery side, also, because the battery prices have fallen, but we've done this study in Niti Aayog that irrespective of lithium, cobalt, or nickel, you can still do about close to 79 to 80% of the value addition domestically without, even if you are importing raw material. And you can do away with cobalt, but lithium is available in plenty. So I don't think this talk about that raw material will not be available is not a correct perspective at all. Secondly, I think there's a lot of technology disruption happening in terms of sodium batteries, which Volkswagen is now pushed ahead. And I think in the next 3 to 4 years, you'll have a huge aluminum air will come in. Many new technologies will also come in. But India should steadfastly say that by 2030, we'll be a champion of EV manufacturing. I mean, there's no reason why Tatas and Mahindra should not look at the global market and become champions of EV vehicles across the world.
So I think the CFL example is quite revealing because, the scale was created because Indian market has the scale. And if you're able to create scale in battery-operated EV vehicles, then I think India itself could provide those exports.
I think that moment is now coming because Tata is now going to come out with 5 or 6 new models. Mahindra is switching over to electric platform. It's coming out with 5 new models. So you will see that actually Tatas and Mahindras at very cost competitive prices will come out with a range of new EV vehicles. And my view on that is that Maruti will increasingly lose market share in India because it's too late in the day in coming out with an electric model.
Wouldn't a government mandate drive the market?
Mandate should be in a phased manner. We should drive the market towards EV. Otherwise, India will lose competitiveness. Its ability to export, its ability to be a global champion of automobile manufacturing will be lost.
The question at the back here.
Oh.
Hi. I have a very simple question, actually. It's great that, India is moving positively in the direction of, solar energy, EV. But I don't think any comment has been made about preserving the existing biodiversity that we have in India. So I just want an opinion on that, because we've actually, deforestation in India has increased severely. We have 1 million hectares of trees that have been removed in the last 10 years. So, we have EVs coming in. We have all these different forms of renewable energy and, clean energy coming in, but what about just the environment that we have in India? It's declining. It's and we see that because I live in India and I've seen my environment decline in that matter. So I'm just hoping for an opinion on that.
It's an EDF question.
If I might just address that, it's a very valid concern. Had I been a panelist, we talked about something in Delhi. There's a British company called Kairos, which has satellites which circle the Earth and measure methane emission super emitter events. And apparently in Delhi, in Ghazipur, at this landfill, I think it was April 2022 or so, there was a super emitter event with 434 tons of methane came out every hour, which is equivalent to 62 million vehicles on the road, okay? And this is the tragic part. The technologies exist in which we can manage landfills. There are business models which exist where you can address them. I'll give a simple example. If you do a waste-to-energy plant in India, there is a tariff regulatory body or something to the extent, which allows you a tariff of 6 to 8 rupees a unit, which gives you an ROI of something like 16%. What happens if you give a tariff of 20 rupees a unit? You get an ROI of 35 rupees. An ROI of 35%, where you can virtually then take over that landfill, do the remediation measures, which are fairly simple technology, just churning the stuff around and dumping some soil on it. It's pretty simple stuff. So you get, methane goes to carbon dioxide, which methane is 86 times more heat inducing than this thing. There are simple technologies, but unfortunately, and this is my take, is we work in silos on some of these very pressing environmental issues. I mean, Delhi has a population, greater Delhi area, 44 million. You have a huge urban rural divide even now in terms of per capita income. It used to be something like 11:1 in 2011 census. We haven't had a recent census, but I suspect it's not changed very much. And a lot of the environmental damage is being driven by an internal migration process, which you cannot stop. You will go where you get a better return. But there are technologies available, processes available where all of this can be broken down, and I hope our friends from the government are listening in terms of, waste management is a very critical area. Amit tells me that it's kaput now, we have to stop. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.